Hello, and welcome back to the Cyber Resilience Brief, a SafeBreach podcast where we go over everything you want to know about breach and attack simulation and about adversarial exposure validation. Today, we have two very special guests with us: Itzik Kotler, the CTO and co founder of SafeBreach, and Michael DeGroat, the VP of Sales Engineering at SafeBreach and a longtime SafeBreach employee. How are you guys doing today?
Doing good. Doing good. Doing well. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you for being here. And today, we are going to discuss CVEs. What can you tell us?
Yeah, so I think, CVE is definitely something that when we think about security posture and adversarial simulation, it's the component that comes to mind. I think that at the time that we are at the moment, we're definitely witnessing a CVE meltdown in terms of how many vulnerabilities are being found by the different software components around us. Yet I think the interesting part is there's also many attacks that are being conducted successfully, unfortunately, that are not CVE related. And I think the interesting perspective that Michael and I have over the years is that we kind of seen how the other attacks are working just as well as CVEs. I think it will be interesting, Michael, if you can think about a couple of examples from the past where you saw certain attacks that were successful that were not CVE related.
Yeah, I think it's an important thing to say is that a CVE is just one way that an adversary can conduct their business, if you will. Over the years that I've been talking to our customers and doing breach and attack simulation activities, so there's been countless different ways that an adversary could conduct an attack and be successful at gaining access or taking data out of an organization that would have nothing to do with the CVE. For example, one of our large technology customers, it was as simple as the ability to download a payload that was a malicious ransomware. And the firewall was not configured to enforce inspection on a well-known port like a 443. The customer is able to go out, grab that ransomware. The ransomware was then able to be executed locally and would lead to a significant security incident. And that had nothing to do with a CVE or something as simple as a malicious URL being emailed to a non-technical user that slipped by the email gateway. Just two very basic examples of the way an adversary can gain access to an organization that would not take advantage of exploiting a CVE at all. And there are many other different ways as well that we've seen over the years, but just two that come straight to mind that are very basic ways that an adversary can gain that access.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right. And as we're kind of witnessing or thinking about the whole campaign, and this is something that came up with the original Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain type of thinking, and then the MITRE attack, which kind of divide and conquer the process. So first of all, as you mentioned, there's complete areas that are not CV related at all. For instance, the exfiltration phase of an attack, right? Where the adversary steals an information, PII, SSN, source code, whatever it is, right? The whole discipline has no CVs attached to it. DNS tunneling, FTP, HTTP, you mentioned, and not having the proper firewall rules to understand what's coming in and out of the network premise. This is completely not CV related. And so even if a company will be 100% patched, it doesn't guarantee that they won't get hacked. And now the other thing that you mentioned here is even a broader story, not just to talk about the process of the campaign, but also about the types of threats. We always kind of subtly assume that the threats coming from the outside and the initial access could leverage a CV. But what about an inside threat, right? I mean, what if the thought is that that person, he or she, already has access to a computer? Maybe they're an employee, maybe they're a contractor, whichever situation they might be, but maybe they already are in the company, so CV is not even required. They already have initial access to the asset.
I think you make a really good point here is that an organization could be 100% compliant with patching. They've ran their vulnerability scans that they're coming up green all across the board, and they could still be breached. It could be as simple as a employee saw a USB drive that someone dropped on the floor. I mean, this is kind of a classic social engineering Example, they dropped a thumb drive, a user plugs it in, and it has malicious code on it that executes the minute it's connected into a USB drive. And that would just be purely either a configuration of an endpoint that says, hey, we don't allow USB thumb drives to be connected to an endpoint, or an endpoint security control that isn't enforcing USB drive access. So it can be something completely innocent in the activity, right? It's not necessarily just a malicious actor who's done something actively to gain access. Just a user just thinking, hey, this is a thumb drive. I want to plug this in and see what's on it. Maybe I can find the owner of it and get it right back to that person. Versus something that's more direct. Even organizations that are highly focused on vulnerability management programs can find themselves susceptible to the simplest of ways that an adversary can get access to the organization. And that isn't to say that CVEs aren't important, right? So I think it's really key to patch your systems, right? At the pace that vulnerabilities and CVEs are being exposed, you're constantly, as a cybersecurity professional, playing kind of the game of whack-a-mole, trying to stay ahead of all of those CVEs. And if you can focus on maybe some of the activities that happen after that exploitation, you give yourself a little more time to manage those CVEs as well. It's another avenue to think about, is that just keeping up with vulnerabilities could be a full-time job for a full team. And so being able to think about the other techniques, like we talk about the MITRE attack framework, that only covers a small part of CVEs, but the rest of it is a large number of techniques adversaries use.
I completely agree with you, Michael. And again, to your point, I will emphasize to say that if there is a vulnerable software and the vendor has released a patch, it doesn't make sense not to patch it. Again, of course, it needs to be prioritized against other tasks, but the bottom line is that when a CV became a known issue, and by definition, a CV is a 1 day, it is not a 0 day, the vendor is aware of it. So the logic is that you should be patching against it as it makes sense to your environments and processes. But you uncover something that I think it's more interesting to talk about here, and that's the configuration. I mean, you gave the examples of the thumb drives and other related things, and I think that a lot of times what we're seeing in the wild from these campaigns is identity and the configuration in that realm being in users that are over provisions with permissions, and what happens once somebody gets their credentials, how further he or she can lateral move within the network, giving just those credentials and then connecting it back into the social engineering angle that you just brought. So let's say that we do get an employee to social engineer, and they end up giving us their credentials, and then we're using that to connect to some kind of a remote system, be it a VPN or SSH or anything else that is publicly exposed. Again, one misconfiguration can be not in having an MFA or further controls on that. But even if there is a way to get inside the company anyway, knowing these credentials and how well the company is configured to prevent identity driven attacks, it's a complete other issue. And again, none of it has to do with CVE. So you can be 100% patched, and still people can use these overly provisioned users and permissions to do things they're not supposed to be doing in the first place.
This kind of brings to mind a POC I did a while back where we were doing various different tests with different user privileges that we were given during the evaluation. And during that evaluation, the customer feels that they have a good grasp on permissions that are assigned to various user profiles, and they think, okay, we've done a really good job here. We've got everything locked down, but they're not going to know until they actually test that. And we were doing testing with these user permissions. We surface things that capabilities that were given to that user that really the customer thought was innocuous, but actually could lead to significant access that was unintended. And the only way they're gonna know that is by doing validation of the infrastructure that they've got in place, validation of whether or not, like, to your point, do they have MFA, enabled? Are they in the right group, and is that group excessively privileged? And doing the attack simulations that we did, we surfaced, hey, this user group that they've created, they thought it was a limited permission group. And in reality, it probably was, but there were still capabilities that an adversary, if they got those credentials, could do. If there's any number of ways that the adversary could get those credentials, again, not taking advantage of a CVE, but pure social engineering, a user reuses passwords from various site to site. All of those things could be leveraged by an adversary and have nothing to do with a vulnerability in a piece of software, just purely configuration, user error, if you will, or lack of user education on how various different ways that they do things can expose them to risks. So I think it's a really interesting identity. I think is really a very interesting way that adversaries can gain access and how you're protecting yourself against identities or identity theft, if you will.
I want to kind of take you back to some of the earlier, years in SafeBreach when you and I were talking to customers and we kind of ran them through this exercise, which is perhaps an extreme reality of what we're discussing here today, which is the assume breach mentality or the assume breach exercise, right? We're talking about CVEs, but CVEs is an assumption that the vendor aware of the vulnerability and the vendor has released the patch. Now, there is also the realm of 0 days where the vendor is not aware of the vulnerability, yet the adversary is aware of it, and then he or she can use it, exploit it, and gain access. So at this kind of extreme reality where there is no CVEs, everything is a 0 day, it's still not a game over, right? The company, the way they're building their defense in depth strategy, the fact that they have acquired a security stack with multiple security products, whether it's on the endpoint and the network, on the gateway, on the identity level. These compensating control and sometimes inline blocking controls are supposed to kick in and help at the different stages of the attack. You previously mentioned thinking about this in terms of time. It's buying you time. Thinking about the element of the time before the CVE, after the CVE, and looking at this as we are for many years as a process, not just as a singular point in time. A CVE is just a potential gateway, potential step in this process of getting compromised or getting breached. I think it's interesting to reflect back and to see that companies that have the assume breach mentality, they have taken the leap to again not ignore CVEs in the sense that they're still pursuing and trying to patch CVEs, but taking it to the next level and assuming there is a 0 day, and then how they're thinking further for ransomware, static exfiltration, just the idea that it doesn't stop with CVEs. CVEs can be a gateway, but there is more to be done before and after.
Yeah, I do think about it, early days that when we first started having conversation with the customers, the assume breach mentality was almost to me it appeared like a new mentality. If you weren't a deep offensive security person, just generally across cybersecurity, the assume breach mentality was not something that many people thought about. They always thought about things from okay, the front door. We got to think about the front door. We got to think about the front door as this space has matured, and I think as cybersecurity in general has looked at things, the assume compromise approach provides a lot of value to organizations and thinking about their security program as a whole, right? It helps change the mindset. They think about things in different layers of protection, different layers of ways that they can keep an adversary from, if they do get in, getting them pigeonholed into one area and keeping them contained in that one area so that when you have those 0 days or you have those unknown activities to get in the front door, that you're protecting yourself still. You're still able to keep that adversary contained into one area, limiting your exposure and limiting what that adversary can do if they do find that 0 day. And this has been a mindset shift that I've seen over the last 8 or 9 years that we've been doing this. I think it's a really positive change of mindset as well.
I agree. And I think it's also very empowering because at the end of the day, as you're saying, companies and people that adopt this mentality and start understanding the meaning of it, they basically flip the script, so to speak, because adversaries, they are coming to the company's network, to the company's computers, to the company's playground, so to speak. And with that knowledge and with that insight, there's a lot that the company can do on multiple levels. There's honeypots, there's different things that can be configured, different alerts and tripwires that can be set. And the whole mindset is shifting between I'm not a victim of an attack, but right now I'm proactively fighting back. I'm proactively designing these traps. And sometimes these traps can be, getting the adversary, as you said, pigeonhole in some kind of area of the network where he or she was going to waste their time trying to find a way to something that doesn't exist, or just even infrastructure that doesn't matter while other things are taking place, or even not being able to do much after they already landed as part of the initial access. But all of this can be possible and is possible once the mindset goes from the reactive to the proactive. And again, CVEs by design are reactive. Something happens and then we need to react to it. We need to patch our networks and computers, which again makes total sense given that this is a risk indicator. This should not be ignored. But things doesn't need to stop there, or things doesn't need to converge into that point. As you said, there is so much that can be done before and after. And at the end of the day, the element of the time is what companies are gaining back when they're adopting their mindset to be more than CVEs.
One thing that I wanted to get onto that is I think when a company takes the assume breach or assume compromise mindset and they start evaluating their infrastructure, they can make more informed decisions about how they react to different vulnerabilities as well, right? So we've talked about this in the past. When you have an idea of where you have some gaps in your security infrastructure, you can also prioritize where you do your vulnerability management and how quickly you need to respond to certain vulnerabilities. So if you already are testing, you already know that we have a certain element of our environment that we are working on hardening and continuing to harden, but it's still a gap. We still have things we need to work on. That may be your priority first for a vulnerability, doing a patch versus some other areas that you well tested and you well defined, you have a strong understanding of what your compensating controls can do. Going back to that time element of being able to say, okay, these areas are what we focus on first because we know we're working on implementing whatever the controls may be. And these other areas where we have controls really, really strong, we've validated those controls and are continuing to validate those controls. Those are lower priority for mitigating a vulnerability than it might be if you didn't have that knowledge and didn't change your mindset to thinking about that assumed compromise type of role there.
Obviously, Michael and I can go for hours and analyze, different things that we saw in the past. I mean, we both have a vast amount of years of doing that and firsthand seeing the results. So it seems very obvious to us, but it's still not obvious to everybody. It's still not the norm out there. It's becoming that because reality kind of shift companies to think more than just CVEs. Between the examples that Michael brought up with the thumb drive, in the email, in the misconfigured firewalls, this is the reality.
Yeah.
Complexity is what kills these companies and what allows the adversaries to find loopholes and get the job done.
The Cyber Resilience Brief is a SafeBreach podcast. It's produced by Tova Devorin and executive produced by Adrian Cully. Sound design provided by Adobe Podcasts. Distribution provided by Podbean, and extra support and love from the SafeBreach team. For more information on how adversarial exposure validation through SafeBreach can protect you and your business, no matter where you reside or what industry you're in, please visit us at www.safebreach.com.